Most people spend their entire lives believing they're free. They confuse routine for freedom, comfort for peace, and distraction for purpose. They wake up, go to work, follow the rules, pay their bills, chase approval, and call it choice. But deep down, if they ever stop to really listen, a quiet truth gnaws at them. This isn't freedom. This is domestication, a curated life based not on authenticity, but on conditioning. Carl Jung understood this better than anyone. He didn't just study the psyche, he waged war against its illusions. And he came to one conclusion: most people can't stomach that true freedom requires facing everything you've been avoiding, especially the parts of yourself you were taught to repress. But before we go deeper, write down in the comments where you're watching this from. Let's see how many of us are starting to wake up, because this message isn't for the soft-hearted or the comfortably numb. It's for the few who have looked around at the world, looked inward at themselves, and realized something isn't right, something doesn't add up. And that freedom might just be another word they were taught to believe in, not something they've actually lived. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That is the cornerstone of his work, and the death sentence to the illusion of freedom. Because if your unconscious mind, your repressed fears, buried traumas, inherited beliefs, is running the show, then who exactly is making your decisions? Who's choosing your relationships, your ambitions, your self-worth? The answer is painful. Not you, not the real you at least. The version of you that was shaped by your parents, your culture, your wounds. Jung's work revealed that most people live as prisoners of their own psyche. And the bars of that prison are invisible. They come in the form of, "This is just how I am," or "This is what people expect from me," or "This is how I was raised." People aren't afraid of being controlled by the government, or religion, or politics. Not really. What terrifies them is the possibility that they've been controlled by themselves, that their whole identity might be a carefully constructed defense mechanism, not a soul expressing its truth. But here's the real tragedy. Most people don't just accept the prison, they decorate it. They build lives, marriages, careers, entire personalities around their unresolved pain. They protect their cage because it feels familiar, safe, predictable. And that's exactly why they'll never be free. Because to escape it, they'd have to tear down everything false about themselves. And that requires radical honesty. Not just with the world, but with themselves. It means facing the parts of them they've denied, the envy, the rage, the weakness, the insecurity, the shame, the shadow. And no one wants to face the shadow. This is the cost of freedom. You don't get it by chasing pleasure or avoiding discomfort. You earn it by burning through the lies you've told yourself and being willing to rebuild your life from the ashes. Jung didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't promise easy answers. He promised that if you had the courage to descend into your own depths, into the unconscious layers of your psyche, you might just come out the other side with something real. Sovereignty. Not perfection, not happiness. Sovereignty. A self that no longer needs to please, pretend, or perform, but very few people ever get there. The first wall most people hit on the path to freedom is a quiet, soul-crushing realization. The self they've spent their whole life defending isn't even theirs, not really. It's a collection of masks, roles, expectations, layered over each other like armor until the original face underneath is barely visible. Carl Jung called this mask the persona. It's not who you are, it's who you present to the world so you'll be accepted by it. It's the smile you wear when you're dying inside, the politeness you perform when you want to scream, the identity you wear because somewhere along the way, someone made you feel like your real one wasn't good enough. And here's the brutal part, the persona works. It gets you approval. It gets you liked. It makes life easier to navigate. That's why people cling to it. But there's a cost. The more you perfect the mask, the more disconnected you become from what's underneath it. Eventually, you don't even know if you're faking it anymore. You just wake up one day and feel like a stranger in your own life. This is where the cracks begin, where discomfort seeps in, where the carefully curated image starts to suffocate you. Jung warned us, The more you identify with the persona, the more you disown your real self. And the more you disown your real self, the more your shadow grows. The shadow is everything you were told not to be. It's the rage you weren't allowed to express, the jealousy you were shamed for, the selfishness you had to bury to earn love. It's your pain, your truth, your hunger, locked away in the basement of your psyche. And the more you suppress it, the more it leaks out in unconscious ways, in passive aggression, in depression, in addiction, in relationships that repeat the same painful patterns again and again. Most people never realize they're living inside this loop. They think they're making choices. They think they're living their truth. But they're just acting out a script they didn't write. A script written by their upbringing, their culture, their fear of rejection. And Jung was clear, as long as you're performing a role, you're not free. You're a prisoner, one who's memorized his lines so well, he's forgotten he's on a stage. Here's the hard truth. Waking up hurts. Seeing the persona for what it is, a shield, a survival strategy, a beautiful lie, can feel like an identity crisis. And it is. Because the moment you stop clinging to who you were taught to be, you're left with a terrifying question. Who am I, really? That's the beginning of freedom. But most people stop right here, because the pain of tearing off the mask feels greater than the pain of keeping it on. So they turn back. They go back to playing the role, back to decorating the cage, back to calling it freedom. Not because they're stupid, not because they're weak, but because facing the truth takes a kind of courage most people aren't taught to have. So what happens when you finally stop pretending? When the persona cracks and you no longer have the energy or the desire to keep performing a version of yourself that isn't real? At first, it feels like everything's falling apart. You might feel lost, ungrounded, even depressed. But here's what Jung understood better than almost anyone: that collapse is necessary. The breakdown isn't the end of you, it's the beginning of you. The false self has to fall apart before the true self can emerge. But here's the catch. The true self doesn't come rushing in with clarity and confidence. It doesn't show up like a savior. It waits. It waits to see if you're ready. Because facing your real self means facing your wounds. Not the ones you talk about, but the ones you buried so deep you forgot they existed. The ones that shaped how you love, how you trust, how you protect yourself. And most people don't want to go there. Why? Because your wounds don't just hurt, they define you. And healing them means letting go of identities you've clung to for safety. It means admitting that some of the stories you've built your entire life around were lies, that the approval you chased wasn't love, that the success you achieved didn't make you whole, that the relationship you fought to keep was just another stage play where you lost yourself in the role. This is what Jung meant when he said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. They'll stay busy, they'll stay angry, they'll stay in toxic relationships, they'll blame everyone else." Because the moment you sit with your real self, without distraction, without a mask, without excuses, you're confronted with everything you've tried to avoid. And this confrontation is brutal. It doesn't care about your ego. It doesn't comfort you. It strips you bare. And most people, when they feel that level of rawness, run. They rush back to the familiar, back to the persona, back to the numbing. They tell themselves they were overthinking, that they're fine, that nothing's wrong, but something is wrong. And deep down, they know it. Here's the truth most people will never say out loud. Freedom is terrifying, not because it's painful, but because it leaves you with no one to blame. When you stop hiding, you can't blame your parents, your ex, your boss, your past. You have to own your choices, your silence, your patterns, and ownership is heavy. But it's also the only way to become whole. That's the paradox. Real freedom doesn't feel good at first. It feels lonely. It feels unstable. It feels like losing everything because in a way, you are. You're losing illusions. You're shedding skins. You're destroying the identity that got you this far so you can finally build one that's real. Most people don't want that. They want relief, not transformation. They want comfort, not truth. That's why they'll never be free. There's a part of you that you don't want to talk about. You don't show it to your friends, you don't post about it, and in most cases, you barely admit it to yourself. It's the version of you that's jealous, spiteful, insecure, judgmental. The version that wants control, validation, revenge. The one that lashes out, that hides, that lies. Carl Jung called this part the shadow, and he believed that unless you confront it, you will never be free. Most people think of personal growth as polishing their strengths, becoming more patient, more disciplined, more positive, but Jung knew better. He knew that growth doesn't happen in the light. It happens in the dark. It happens when you have the courage to face the ugliest, most inconvenient truths about yourself and stop pretending they don't exist. That doesn't mean becoming a worse person. It means becoming an honest one. Because here's the truth. You are not only your kindness, your ambition, your generosity. You are also your resentment, your rage, your self-centeredness. These aren't flaws to be erased. They are aspects of your psyche that need to be understood. Because the shadow, left in the dark, doesn't disappear. It controls you from behind the scenes. It shows up in projection, in the things that trigger you in others because you haven't dealt with them in yourself. It shows up in sabotage, in the relationships you ruin, the chances you don't take, the cycles you keep repeating without knowing why. It shows up in the mask you wear, the one that smiles while your chest burns with unspoken emotion. Integration is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. It's the process of looking at your darkest traits, not with shame, but with curiosity. It's asking, where did this come from? Why does this part of me exist? What is it trying to protect me from? Because every part of your shadow was born from something, a wound, a fear, a moment when you learned it was safer to suppress than to express. And until you go back to that root, you will never truly know yourself. Jung warned us, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. You'll keep choosing the wrong partners, keep playing the same roles, keep sabotaging your peace, not because you're cursed, but because you're on autopilot. And until you wake up to the shadow, it will keep writing your story while you call it destiny. Most people avoid this work because it's uncomfortable, because it threatens their identity. But if you're brave enough to do it, you'll discover something powerful. Your shadow isn't your enemy. It's the key to your freedom. It holds the energy, the passion, the strength you've disowned. And when you learn how to own it consciously, you become someone no longer ruled by fear, but led by clarity. Freedom doesn't begin with success. It doesn't begin with self-improvement, positivity, or even healing. Real freedom begins with confrontation, specifically the confrontation of everything inside you that makes you uncomfortable. Carl Jung understood this better than almost anyone. He didn't talk about liberation as a dream. He talked about it as a brutal inner process, one that demands honesty, not comfort. And this is precisely why most people will never be free. Because when they meet the parts of themselves they've been trained to fear, they turn away. You've been conditioned since childhood to disown your complexity, to suppress the traits that don't align with what others expect from you. Were you punished for speaking up? Then you learned to silence yourself. Were you rewarded for being agreeable? Then you learned to betray your truth for approval. Slowly, almost invisibly, you were taught that safety comes from performance, not presence. So you began living behind a mask, a socially acceptable version of yourself that always says the right thing, fits in, and never makes anyone uncomfortable. But that mask has a cost. Jung called what lies behind the mask the shadow. It's everything you repress, everything you deny, everything you hide. Not just the dark impulses, but the raw, real instincts that were inconvenient to others. Your ambition, your desire, your outrage, your hunger for something more. And the tragic thing is, once you bury these parts of yourself, you also bury your vitality. You lose access to your depth, your intuition, your fire. You become a hollow version of who you could be. Disciplined, maybe, functional perhaps, but never truly alive. This is the great paradox of human psychology. The more you deny what's inside you, the more it controls you. You think you're in charge, but you're not. You're being steered by repressed rage, unresolved fears, unconscious patterns that sabotage your relationships and decisions, and yet you keep chasing surface-level solutions, new habits, new goals, another meditation app. But you're building on sand. Until you go to the root, until you face the shadow, you're just decorating a prison cell and calling it growth. That's why Jung's work matters more now than ever. He wasn't trying to make you a better person. He was trying to help you become a whole person. And wholeness requires the courage to reclaim everything you were told to throw away. The instincts you labeled as bad, the thoughts you were ashamed to admit, the moments of raw emotion that society called weakness. Jung saw these not as flaws to eliminate, but as signals, pathways to your truth. The problem is, truth isn't always comfortable. In fact, it's rarely what your ego wants to hear. And this is where the path splits. Most people will keep seeking validation. They'll double down on performance. They'll try to be more positive, more liked, more spiritual, while quietly suffocating under the weight of everything they refuse to feel. But a few will stop running. A few will sit down with their pain, their jealousy, their rage, and say, "I'm not afraid of you anymore." And in that moment, they take their first real breath. Because freedom doesn't come from perfection, it comes from integration. If you want to stop being a puppet to other people's expectations, if you want to stop living a life that looks good on the outside but feels hollow inside, you must be willing to reclaim what you've disowned. That doesn't make you dangerous, it makes you complete. And when you're complete, you're no longer easy to control. You don't chase approval because you approve of yourself. You don't fear rejection because you've accepted your own darkness. You don't need to be saved because you've already walked through hell and met yourself on the other side. Let's get honest about the system you live in, because the reason most people never become free isn't just psychological, it's structural. Your conditioning didn't happen by accident. It was manufactured, reinforced, rewarded. You were trained to be obedient, to be useful, to be predictable. And society loves you like that, polished on the surface, conflicted underneath, and too distracted to ever rebel. Carl Jung saw this long before it became obvious. The average person is not just disconnected from their shadow, they're domesticated, shaped by institutions, dulled by comfort, and weaponized against their own truth. Look around. What's rewarded in this world? It's not depth, it's conformity. It's smiling when you're dying inside. It's agreeing when you know it's a lie. It's shrinking your truth to fit the narrative. From schools to corporations, religions to social media, the message is the same. Don't think too deeply. Don't feel too strongly. Don't question what you're told. Stay in line. Be nice. Be normal. Be safe. But here's what they never told you. Safety is often the price of your soul. Jung warned that the modern individual faces a crisis of meaning, not because there's a lack of purpose, but because the paths we're given are pre-scripted. You're told what success is, what love should look like, what goals to chase. And if you start questioning those scripts, the system doesn't give you answers. It gives you distractions. Entertainment, endless content, consumer fixes, and spiritual bypassing dressed up as positivity. You're handed tools that keep you asleep while convincing you that you're awake. This is why the journey to freedom is so rare, because it doesn't just require inner strength. It demands a refusal to play the game. And the game is everywhere. It's in the way you're taught to measure your worth. It's in the way people look at you when you speak your truth without softening it. It's in the guilt you feel for choosing yourself. Every time you set a boundary, say no, or break away from the tribe, you'll be made to feel like a threat. Not because you're wrong, but because you're no longer compliant. And that's the moment of truth. Because right there, where you feel the pressure to conform, is exactly where freedom begins. Not in rebellion for its own sake, but in the clarity that you no longer owe the world a version of yourself that makes others comfortable. Jung understood that true liberation only happens when you withdraw your energy from the masks you were trained to wear. That's why individuation isn't some aesthetic journey of self-love. It's a radical act of defiance. It's choosing depth over decoration, truth over performance. It's stepping outside the matrix of expectation and becoming someone no system can fully control. But be warned, freedom has a cost. You'll lose some people. You'll outgrow environments. You'll become unrecognizable to the version of yourself that once settled. But in that loss, you'll find something sacred. Your own authority, your own rhythm, your own voice, unfiltered by fear. And when you live from that place, you don't just feel free, you become untouchable. Not because you have nothing to lose, but because you've already let go of everything that was holding you hostage. So how do you begin? What does it actually look like to walk away from the life you were taught to want and start living the one that aligns with who you really are? It starts with something deceptively simple, but incredibly rare: radical self-honesty. Not the filtered kind of honesty you post online, not the rehearsed version you tell friends when you're half ready to admit you're lost. I'm talking about the raw, unflinching truth you usually avoid, the one you hear in the quiet moments, then immediately drown out with noise, work, or distraction. Carl Jung said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And you know it's true. Most people stay busy because stillness is unbearable. Stillness forces you to confront the reality that you're unhappy, unfulfilled, disconnected from your own center. And yet, that confrontation is the doorway. You can't begin the process of becoming free until you see what's actually holding you. And often, it's not other people. It's the lies you agreed to. It's the comfort you mistook for peace. It's the routine that numbed you into forgetting you ever had a wild, sovereign mind to begin with. The second step is deconstruction, not in a destructive, chaotic way, but in a conscious, surgical way. You start asking, where did this belief come from? Who told me I needed to live like this? Why do I keep showing up in places that don't reflect me? And when the answers come, because they always do, you have to have the courage to sit with them, not rationalize them, not run from them. Sit with them until the illusion cracks and the old self starts to dissolve. That's where freedom gets real, when your identity is no longer built on external permission. But don't expect applause for this. People won't cheer you on when you stop being the version of yourself that serves their comfort. In fact, the moment you step into truth, you'll feel resistance. From others, from your own mind, from the world that profited off your silence. That's why most never cross the threshold. Because the first taste of liberation is not lightness, it's grief. You'll grieve the years you lost, the versions of you that were performative, the love you accepted just to avoid abandonment. And that grief is holy. It means you're waking up. From there, you begin to rebuild. Not a better mask, but a self. A centered, integrated, intentional self. One that doesn't need to please or perform. One that doesn't chase validation. One that can hold boundaries without guilt and speak the truth without apology. Jung called this individuation, not becoming perfect, but becoming whole. It's not about erasing your pain. It's about owning it, integrating it, letting it sharpen your discernment and deepen your presence. And here's the paradox. The freer you become, the less you need to fight. You don't argue with people who don't see you. You don't over-explain your worth. You simply walk with clarity, and your energy speaks for you. Most people won't understand it. They're not supposed to. You didn't become free to be understood. You became free to be yourself. If you ever truly break away from the herd, you'll feel it immediately. The silence, the distance, the way conversations become thinner, how certain people stop calling, how your presence suddenly feels too much for those still playing by the old rules. And this is where most people turn back, because what no one tells you about freedom is how lonely it is at first. Not because you're unlovable, not because you did something wrong, but because the version of you that fit into the world before doesn't exist anymore. Carl Jung said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." Once you begin to see through the masks, your own and everyone else's, you'll notice how shallow most conversations are. You'll see the small talk as a defense mechanism, the niceties as camouflage, the fake positivity as an anesthetic against truth. And when you start speaking from a place of self-awareness, you'll notice how few people are actually listening, because real presence is rare. Real connection requires depth. And most people aren't ready for it. They'd rather keep pretending everything is fine. This is why the path to freedom can feel like exile, because you're no longer part of the emotional economy where everyone trades validation for conformity. You're no longer useful in the way others were used to. You're not easy to manipulate anymore. You're not quick to flatter. You don't play along. You see through the performance, and your silence makes them uncomfortable. That's not arrogance, it's clarity. It's what happens when you stop living for external approval. And here's the hardest part. Even the people who once loved you might feel threatened by your transformation, not because you've become cruel, but because you've become real. You don't apologize for your boundaries. You don't dilute your truth to keep the peace. You don't shapeshift to be liked. And for those still clinging to the illusion, your freedom feels like rebellion. They'll say you've changed, and you'll have to accept that as a compliment, because you did. But this stage is temporary. It's the necessary solitude between who you were and who you're becoming. And in that space, something powerful happens. You begin to hear yourself clearly, your intuition sharpens, you start building relationships that aren't based on neediness or pretense. You start creating instead of performing. You begin to live, not react. You realize you don't need a crowd when you've got your center. So if you're in that space right now, alone, misunderstood, questioning everything, don't retreat. Don't soften yourself to make others comfortable. Stay there. That's the space where self-respect is built. That's where sovereignty is forged, because once you come out the other side, you'll carry a kind of peace no one can touch. A peace that doesn't rely on being seen or validated or agreed with. A peace rooted in the fact that, finally, you belong to yourself. Now that you've seen what freedom really requires, what it costs, what it shakes loose, there's only one question left to ask. And it's not rhetorical, it's not poetic, it's brutally simple. Will you choose it? Because it is a choice. No matter how much pain you've endured, no matter how much awareness you've gained, freedom is never automatic. Seeing the cage is not the same as walking out of it. Jung warned us, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And that's the tragedy. Most people get a glimpse of truth, a spark of consciousness, and instead of following it, they run back to comfort, to certainty, to the roles they hate but know how to play. They don't walk away because freedom requires something they're not ready to give up: control, the illusion of it, the story that says, if I stay quiet, if I stay agreeable, I'll be safe. But you're not safe. You're just silent. You're not comfortable. You're numb. You're not loved for who you are. You're tolerated for who you pretend to be. That's why true freedom begins with a kind of death, the death of the mask, the death of being liked, the death of who they told you to be. And most people won't go there, not because they're weak, but because they're still hoping. Hoping to be accepted, hoping to be chosen, hoping someone will give them permission to be whole. But no one is coming to do that for you. No one is coming to free you. They benefit from your compliance too much. This is the Jungian paradox. You cannot truly live until a part of you is willing to die, until you're willing to be alone, willing to be misunderstood, willing to be seen as difficult, selfish, cold, until you stop negotiating with people who never saw you to begin with, until you realize that the world won't give you freedom, you have to take it. But once you do, something irreversible happens. You stop playing the role. You stop dimming your light. You stop explaining yourself. And the world, though it may not applaud, adjusts. The people who were never really with you fall away. The ones who are real find you. And best of all, you find you. Not the version that performs, not the one that survives, but the one that's been buried under years of pleasing, proving, and pretending. That's who you return to. That's who you become. And from that place, you are untouchable. Not because life stops testing you, but because nothing owns you anymore. Not their judgment, not their expectations, not your past. You've reclaimed your mind. You've reclaimed your choices. And that's what Jung meant by freedom, not the absence of struggle, but the presence of self. So here we are. No more illusions, no more waiting for permission, just one question, echoing louder than ever. Will you choose to be free?